Plugged In, I'm Greta Van Susteren. This week, the annual State of the Union. As required by the United States Constitution, the President delivers the State of the Union to a joint session of Congress. And this Congress this year is highly partisan and divided. President Trump making an urgent appeal for bipartisanship in an hour-long speech demanding action on border security, health care, immigration, and the economy. We're going to bring you analysis and perspective on the president's address to Congress from a well-known historian and by our team of hardworking reporters. We're live on Facebook at Voice of America, and we'd love to hear your comments and your questions. Originally scheduled 1 week earlier, President Donald Trump's State of the Union address had been postponed by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi. The Speaker had disinvited the president from delivering a speech until after the end of what ultimately became the longest partial government shutdown in U.S. history. The partisan debate to build or not to build a wall at the southern border was at the heart of the shutdown leading up to Tuesday night's State of the Union. With a look at some of the highlights, here's VOA White House reporter Patsy Widakuswara.
Madam Speaker, the President of the United States!
President Trump broke with tradition and began his State of the Union speech without waiting to be introduced by the Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, with whom he clashed with in recent weeks.
We must reject the politics of revenge, resistance, and retribution.
As is the norm, Trump gave a long list of achievements.
There's nothing anywhere in the world that can compete with America.
But immigration soon came to the forefront, an issue Trump is fighting with Democrats who continue to deny his demand for $5.7 billion border wall funding.
In the past, most of the people in this room voted for a wall, but the proper wall never got built. I will get it built.
The wall feud partially closed the government for 35 days. If no deal is reached by February 15th, another government shutdown looms.
He didn't give the Democrats anything that they wanted to hear. He didn't make any offerings. He didn't propose any compromises. I don't think he moved anyone any closer towards a solution for keeping the government open.
Female lawmakers of the Democratic Party wore white to mark the suffragette movement that led to women's right to vote. Most of them did not clap during the speech, except when Trump extended an olive branch and noted that a century after suffragette, a record number of women are serving in Congress. On foreign policy, Trump expressed support for regime change in Venezuela and touted what he considered his successes, including the trade war with China, the U.S. withdrawal from a nuclear treaty with Russia, the reduction of tensions with North Korea, and the continuing pressure on Iran. Trump outlined elements of a bipartisan agenda, such as boosting infrastructure, giving paid family leave, lowering the cost of health care, eradicating HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, and childhood cancer. But he also pushed for issues important to his political base, including legislation prohibiting late-term abortions, and slammed the investigation into possible collusion between his presidential campaign and Russia during the 2016 election.
If there is going to be peace and legislation, there cannot be war and investigation.
Stacey Abrams, who narrowly lost a bid in November to be Georgia's governor, delivered the Democratic response highlighting access to voting rights.
We must reject the cynicism that says allowing every eligible vote to be cast and counted is a power grab.
From marriage equality, health care to confronting racism, Abrams laid out her party's agenda.
I think it sent a message that this is the Democratic Party of today. A woman of color, a woman who comes not from the politician class.
Another notable moment, possibly the first in a State of the Union address, lawmakers breaking out in song. For one of the president's guests, Pittsburgh synagogue massacre survivor Judah Samet on his 81st birthday. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
For their thoughts on key moments in President Trump's State of the Union, we are joined by a team of experienced journalists who cover the president and Congress. Steve Herman is VOA's White House bureau chief. Jim Malone is our senior national correspondent. And Catherine Gibson is our political and congressional reporter on Capitol Hill. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Steve, let me start with you. What stood out in the president's address last night? And I'll get to all our guests.
Well, I think what stood out was we really did see a disciplined president here. Teleprompter Trump rather than Twitter Trump. He stuck to the message. There were a few ad libs, but not so many. And he had a very captive audience for a long period of time, which he really seemed to enjoy. Of course, these speeches are mostly to a domestic audience, so for people overseas who may have been disappointed that there wasn't more mention of Asia, except for that reference to China and trade, and really nothing about Africa, one sentence or two about Venezuela, keep in mind that this really was a domestic speech for a domestic audience.
Jim, what struck you?
Well, Greta, three things really. First of all, the president made an appeal for bipartisanship, but then a little later on quickly warned Democrats that if you go into investigation mode, we're basically going to be at war. So in a way, that's a classic Donald Trump, you know, let's work together if we can, but if you come at me, I'll come at you. His focus on the border wall and immigration, that's obviously very important to him. I think he sees it as his key re-election issue in 2020. And the third thing I thought was the image of the Democratic women, congresswomen in the House chamber, rising up all dressed in white. That was a strong visual because that presented, in a sense, the immediate resistance to Donald Trump as he tries to sort of get on track here in the second 2 years of his term.
Catherine, you're on Capitol Hill, and you deal with members of Congress every day.
Right.
What struck you?
Well, what struck me is what Jim touched on a little bit, were those calls for compromise and bipartisanship. But at the same time, in speaking with congressional Democrats after that speech, they said that, well, that's all nice and good to hear that from the president in a State of the Union speech. What they're really listening to is his Twitter feed, is what he's saying day by day, and really what he does in the upcoming week in terms of those border security negotiations, and whether he was really laying the groundwork for a declaration of a national emergency so that he can just go ahead and build that border wall. I think that's what we were all looking for last night up here on Capitol Hill.
You know, Catherine, what struck me is he almost buried the headline in his speech, because the most newsworthy thing that he said, besides, you know, sort of the give and take of politics and people standing up and clapping, is the fact that he announced that he's going to meet for the second time with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, going to meet in Vietnam at the end of February. That's the big news item. Are people talking about that at all on the Hill?
Oh, absolutely. That was a big topic of discussion in Statuary Hall after the speech. You know, I was speaking with some House Foreign Relations Democrats who are saying that they really want to see deliverables come out of this summit, that the first summit set the groundwork. It was good to get that discussion going, but now they really want to see deliverables from the president when he goes to that second meeting.
All right, everyone stand by. As many expected, President Trump spoke extensively about the need to build a wall at the southern border.
As we speak, large, organized caravans are on the march to the United States. We have just heard that Mexican cities, in order to remove the illegal immigrants from their communities, are getting trucks and buses to bring them up to our country in areas where there is little border protection. I have ordered another 3,750 troops to our southern border to prepare for this tremendous onslaught. My administration has sent to Congress a common sense proposal to end the crisis on the southern border. It includes humanitarian assistance, more law enforcement, drug detection at our ports, closing loopholes that enable child smuggling, and plans for a new physical barrier or wall to secure the vast areas between our ports of entry. In the past, most of the people in this room voted for a wall, but the proper wall never got built. I will get it built.
Steve, he certainly dug his heels in on that one. He's going to build the wall. But the reason we had the government shutdown was over this wall, and the shutdown is only, the lifting of it is only till February 15th. At the White House, did they think that the president's statements last night is going to in any way move the Democrats?
Well, what the president is going to do between now and then is essentially double down on this. It's just been announced that he'll be holding his first political rally of 2019 in El Paso, Texas. Now, that's a border town, and The politicians there have said they don't need any more wall. So he's taking it right to the border on Monday and is going to have this front and center. So stay tuned. This issue is not going to be resolved quickly or easily, it seems.
Jim, this is almost a 2020 political issue, besides the fact of the impact that the government could be shut down once again on February 15th. But this is, he's dug his heels in. The president and Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, says no.
Right.
So something's got to give between now and February 15th, or else we're in another shutdown.
Yeah, although I do think that the chances of another shutdown are somewhat remote because a lot of Republicans don't seem to want to go down that route. I think
But then the president doesn't satisfy his base.
Here's the thing. I think the president is in a weaker position on this issue now than before last year's elections. Not only did Democrats take control of the House, they also basically won the battle of the shutdown. The president's poll ratings went down during the shutdown, and he got the lion's share of the blame for the shutdown. So now he is trying to argue with a Congress that's half controlled by the Democrats for his priority. And he's already scaled back, by the way. During the campaign, he talked about a wall from sea to sea, basically. Now he keeps scaling it back a bit. This is for a chunk of the wall. This is going to be fencing and so forth. So I just think, yes, what motivates him is pleasing his base, but he has somewhat boxed himself in as to how he's going to get to that point. Now, I think he has a weaker hand in these negotiations.
Catherine, I don't suppose that the Democrats are going to give him much on Capitol Hill on this. I mean, they have likewise drawn their line in the sand on this. Last night, after the president's State of the Union, do you get any sense that the Democrats are going to give a little bit on this wall and meet the president even halfway?
No, and I spoke to a couple of Texas Democrats, and they said that they didn't hear anything in the president's language that would move them a bit on this issue. And I think what you saw was a really telling moment with Nancy Pelosi. When the president started to speak about those caravans, you can see Nancy Pelosi behind him, and she's motioning. Now, that's because some of the Democrats in the chamber wanted to start booing the president, and she was telling them, no, this isn't the moment for that. I think that really speaks to her control of her caucus and how she's kept them together throughout this shutdown fight. But of course, the president also hit on an issue that I think he really knows how to highlight. And that's when he said that on the issue of immigration, there's really a divide in this country between the working class and the political class. And for him to continue showing that separation between Washington, D.C. and his voters out in the rest of the country, I can tell you that from traveling around the country and speaking to them, that really resonates with them and will continue to resonate in 2020.
All right, well, President Trump is a Republican. The opposing political party, the Democrats, responded to the president's State of the Union address, and Stacey Abrams, a rising star in the Democratic Party, was chosen to rebut President Trump. She agreed with the president's calls for bipartisanship on issues such as immigration, but she slammed the president for engineering what she called a disgraceful government shutdown.
We know bipartisanship could craft a 21st century immigration plan, but this administration chooses to cage children and tear families apart. Compassionate treatment at the border is not the same as open borders. President Reagan understood this. President Obama understood this. Americans understand this. And Democrats stand ready to effectively secure our ports and borders. But we must all embrace that from agriculture to healthcare to entrepreneurship, America is made stronger by the presence of immigrants, not walls.
This is the rebuttal for the Democrats, the Republican, but the rebuttal is done without even knowing what's going to be what President Trump had to say. So
right.
it's a difficult task.
It is. It is. She did well, though. She's a rising national star. She symbolizes this rising electorate within the Democratic Party, women voters, minority voters. And it's interesting what we just heard because it was about immigration. And this is one of the great divide issues right now. For the president's base, it's very important, symbolically and realistically, to have security along the border, to believe in his claims or his desire for a wall. But Democrats see the issue as a very divisive one, as castigating immigrants in a negative light. And right now, what the challenge for the president is, he's not been able to convince more Americans to side with him. A little over 40% want the wall, but in the mid-50s are opposed to it. And also, he's not not convinced enough Americans that it's actually a national crisis along the southern border. Again, a minority of voters see it that way, see it the president's way. So he's got more salesmanship to do, and the rally that Steve mentioned earlier, maybe that will be another opportunity for him to pounce on that.
Steve, after the president left the Capitol, having given the State of the Union, he travels quickly about 16 blocks to the White House, where you are. So I don't know if he got to see the rebuttal. Is anyone saying anything about how the rebuttal? What are they saying about the rebuttal at the White House, if anything? Are they ignoring it?
They're brushing it off, but I think we saw a preview of where the president is going to go between now and 2020, and talking about, as Jim mentioned, trying to get a little bit stronger numbers for him, which he'll need for re-election, or to keep that base really firm. He brought up this threat of socialists and socialism last night. He's going to paint the Democrats as socialists, as a far left, as threats to national security. There was that preview, I believe, in that State of the Union last night.
Catherine, I thought, and everyone comes to this with a different perspective, a different opinion. I thought that she was easy to listen to, meaning not whether someone should agree with her or not, but that she was easy to listen to in her rebuttal. Within the Democratic caucus on Capitol Hill, were they pleased with her, or did they want her to come out swinging more against the president? What's the verdict there?
Well, in the immediate moments after the State of the Union speech, while the Abrams speech was going on, I was speaking with some of the Democrats, and they were coming out swinging against President Trump in the same ways that we saw Abrams do. Saying that this rhetoric about immigration is divisive, that it's not speaking to the American people and what they're going to be wanting in this upcoming presidential election. And it was really striking the wrong tone if the president did want to strike an air of compromise.
Well, the president also spoke about working together with Democrats to improve the lives of people in the middle class. But he also railed against what he called the politics of revenge.
Now we must step boldly and bravely into the next chapter of this great American adventure. And we must create a new standard of living for the 21st century. An amazing quality of life for all of our citizens is within reach. We can make our community safer, our families stronger, our culture richer, our faith deeper, and our middle class bigger and more prosperous than ever before. But we must reject the politics of revenge, resistance, and retribution, and embrace the boundless potential of cooperation, compromise, and the common good.
Well, Jim, in sort of the historic environment of the Capitol, everyone's sort of a little bit polite, and the president rails against the politics of revenge. But we're now going into the 2020 presidential race, and it really is sort of buckle up, put your seatbelt on, because we're going to see the most vicious going back and forth between these parties. And
the whole idea of can they cooperate? Republicans will argue that the Democrats are unfair because they see everything through an anti-Trump prism. And so they see him as the enemy, and therefore they're not interested in...
And the flip side, it's Speaker Pelosi is the enemy.
Right. And the problem there, too, once a year we have the president come to the chamber, ask for bipartisanship. Most of the days of the rest of the year, he's on Twitter. And a lot of those are attacks on various opponents and so forth. So I think that's where the Democrats would argue, well, it's hard to believe someone who comes to us once a year with this idea, and then the rest of the time he's a pretty divisive figure.
Steve, over at the White House, do you have any sort of inside scoop on, did the president practice his address beforehand? Did he have a big role in writing it? I mean, every year there's sort of the intrigue, whether it's President Obama, President Bush, who wrote what, and how much did the president practice, and how much did he ad-lib and go off script?
Well, no president writes their State of the Union speech, and there were definitely a lot of hands in that. I think you could see that with the different moods in the speech, part of it conciliatory, other parts of it confrontational. There was definitely some of input from Stephen Miller, who's a hardliner on immigration, and he did appear to practice it. I think a lot of people, even people who are critics of the president, would say that this was probably his most polished speech yet.
Catherine, I was waiting to listen for a few things. I think we all are, but there was no mention of the African continent that I heard. You know, it's a big world out there, but there's a lot of stuff about domestic things. It's the State of the Union, but nonetheless, foreign policy is part of the State of the Union.
Right. It was certainly one of the more domestic States of the Union that I ever remember listening to or covering, and that was mentioned in Statuary Hall last night after the speech. People were a little surprised that there wasn't a little bit more foreign policy meat in this speech. I will tell you that the moment that really stood out is that moment when the president mentioned the women, when you saw those House Democratic women dressed all in white, standing up as the president mentioned that they're in more jobs now more than ever. That was really the moment, the visual moment of the State of the Union for me, and it was certainly something that everyone was talking about up here on Capitol Hill last night.
Which was so clever of the president, because many people would say, is there so many women in Congress because we just had an election in November, and a lot of people say that women ran for this office because they had some sort of, to run against the president, essentially.
That's so right, because I spoke to some of the women afterwards, and they said when the president initially said that, they all kind of looked around at each other like, well, should we get up and applaud that? You know, the president is actually recognizing our achievements. There was a little bit of confusion in that moment there, and then, you know, of course, you saw them. They stood up, they clapped, they did the raise the roof signal. It was an interesting moment where he had that interplay with the president.
Steve, the president had some guests. He noted that the First Lady, of course, was in the room and up in the balcony. Who did he bring to the State of the Union?
Well, that's the part that I think really worked the best. We had some war heroes going back all the way to World War II, Holocaust survivors, victims of crimes that the president said had been committed by illegal aliens. And then also a young boy, a sixth grader, who has the family name of Trump. And the president said that he had been a victim of bullying because of his family name.
Steve, Jim, and Catherine, thank you all joining us. And now we're going to look at the big picture at this year's State of the Union, and we're joined by James Thurber. He is a distinguished professor of government at American University, founder and former director at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies. And he's written more than 80 articles and chapters, from presidential congressional relations to lobbying reform. His latest book is entitled Rivals for Power. Welcome, Professor.
Good to be here.
So your thoughts on the State of the Union?
Well, I've listened to all of the interviews, and no one really talked about what wasn't talked about in the State of the Union.
Except Africa.
Africa, but climate change, the debt and the deficit, major issue at this point, wasn't discussed. He didn't talk about a couple of continents, South America and Africa, much.
Venezuela would have been.
Yeah, a little bit. He also didn't talk about the fact that he's behind in his appointments, and that some of the appointments have had serious ethical issues. And in fact,
and he might say that some of them are held up by Senator Mitch McConnell of his own party in Capitol Hill to get confirmation hearings.
Yes, but it's historic in terms of the numbers that haven't gone forward so far. The Democrats, on the other hand, are very concerned about ethics, and they have a thing called the H.R. 1. It's an ethics and lobbying reform bill that will go after him, and they'll have lots of oversight hearings, but this bill is going forward to focus on some of these issues. The context of this speech was incredible. I mean, we're highly polarized. He's a populist president appealing to his base. He did a good job. It was almost like a campaign speech, in my opinion, with respect to immigration, abortion, other issues. This is not going to change America. America is highly polarized out there.
Well, that's what I said. I love the pomp and circumstance of the State of the Union, whether it's this president or former presidents has delivered it, and it's been going on for a long time. Does anything ever change historically as a result of the State of the Union? I remember that President Bush talked about the axis of evil, and I actually think that had a profound impact. But other than that, historically, what does the State of the Union mean to the American people and to the world?
Well, you have to have a clear external threat to the United States for the State of the Union message to have an impact. For example, during World War II, the Great Depression, the invasion of Saddam into Kuwait, the 9/11. These things really are important. People are looking for leadership. We have a clear external threat. We have people asking for the president to say something about it. It means something then, and policies can change. Generally, policies don't change, politics don't change. The polarization of America will not change as a result of this. He's appealing to one side of that polarization, the conservatives, people in rural America, people not on the coasts where people are doing very well economically, and the Republicans are appealing there too. The Democrats are appealing to, let's do something about health care. He really didn't talk about the Affordable Care Act, our major reform recently. He talked about prescription drug price reductions, and there's been some, and there may be some common ground there. Secondly, there may be common ground on infrastructure investment. We'll see.
To what extent is it fair to criticize him for that? I mean, we don't want this thing to take 6 hours. I mean, it's sort of, I mean, all those are very important topics that you raised. It's like, you know, I'm trying to think, like, if I were writing this speech or delivering this speech, how I would hit all those topics. They're all very important.
Well, they're important to what he said in the campaign, important right now in terms of what's on the policy agenda, especially infrastructure.
But for the American people, I mean, health care is important, infrastructure is important. I mean, this is all very important
things. But health care is very important to the Republicans and to him in terms of getting rid of the Affordable Care Act. He really didn't talk about that. Remember, for years, they tried to get rid of it. They voted 56 times to get rid of it, and they didn't get rid of it. And so all of a sudden, it's not there, but the American people are very concerned about getting access and finance of their health care.
All right, let me give it, we have just a few minutes left. Stacey Abrams, who gave the rebuttal, it's a rebuttal, but it's sort of hard to do a rebuttal when it's right after without any thought. But I don't think she was able to hear President Trump. I don't know if she was, but what was your thought about the rebuttal?
Well, I thought she did a very good job, and her style was good, but content.
Yeah, I thought she was easy to listen to.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, whether you agreed with her or not, you know what I mean?
Very easy to listen to. She wasn't in your face, pushing back hard left messages. I think it was a symbol of where the Democratic Party is going. It's a woman, African American. She has a future in the party. I thought it was a good idea to have her.
So, and we should probably explain to our viewers is that that's a tactical, sort of a political decision who you get to do the rebuttal. We've had very interesting rebuttals over the past, many years.
We have, but those rebuttals are not like Obama's speech at the Democratic Convention, where it launches you into a big career. They're important, and certainly she did a good job. It will help her, but it's not a launching pad for a national campaign.
But it could be a career killer too.
Yeah, and it has been. Some people have done very poorly, and I thought it was good. It was a good idea, and especially to have her from Georgia rather than from here. I think that's very important.
What about the use of everyone bringing dates, essentially guests? And I mean, the president, we talked about a little bit here who the president brought, but the Democrats brought people too. And is this an honor for them, or are they being used as props, political props?
Well, it's an honor, and they're being used as political props, and I think that it's, in a way, getting out of hand. Now everyone's going to have someone that they bring or they have associated with this, and then with their tweets and other things they'll send back to their constituents who they have. It's to help them politically, it's to help the party politically, but it's gotten a little out of hand, maybe.
You know, if there had been more time with the president here, there are things that I want to hear, even like the China's footprint around the world, what China's doing with its infrastructure, and as we noted, everything that's going on in Africa, but we don't get that. At least not now.
No comment about South China Sea expansion of the power of China militarily, and that's very important to our military and to some people in Southeast Asia.
But it's a good lesson in civics. We got that. It's also some transparency in our government. We get to see our president speak. So, that's important too. And it's required by the Constitution that the president do that. So
that's right.
Never dull. Anyways, thank you, sir, for joining us.
Yeah.
That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice America. You can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And do follow me on Twitter. It's @Greta. Thanks for being plugged in.